What would you do if your HOA tried to stop an ambulance from saving your loved one's life, because of a parking violation? The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks across the quiet suburban street as the ambulance skidded to a halt in front of 214 Oakwood Lane. The sirens had been cut to a softer wail, but the urgency in the air was undeniable. Inside the home, Henry Wallace lay gasping for breath, his frail body sinking into the living room couch, while his granddaughter, Sophie Harper, gripped her phone with trembling fingers, her voice breaking as she pleaded with the dispatcher. Her grandfather's face was turning an alarming shade of gray. She knew every second counted. Ryan Carter barely had time to throw the ambulance into park before he and his partner, Jess Morgan, grabbed their gear and sprinted toward the house. Years of experience had taught them how to move fast under pressure, and this was no different, except it was. Because before they could even reach the front steps, a sharp, nasal voice cut through the night air like a razor. "Excuse me. Excuse me. Where do you think you're going?" Both paramedics skidded to a halt, their adrenaline-fueled momentum interrupted by a figure standing in their path. A woman in her late 50s, arms folded tight, her overstyled blonde bob so stiff it barely moved. The unmistakable glint of power-hungry authority shone in her narrowed eyes. Ryan didn't have time for this. "Ma'am, step aside. We have a medical emergency." But Karen, because of course her name was Karen, didn't budge. If anything, she planted herself more firmly between them and the house, her lips curling into a smirk that practically dripped condescension. "This is private property. HOA rules clearly state that all visitors, including emergency vehicles, must register before parking on the street." Jess blinked. She must have misheard. "Are you serious?" Karen let out a clipped laugh and pulled out a clipboard, an actual clipboard. She waved it in front of their faces as if she had just presented a court order. "Absolutely. And you'll need to pay the $250 emergency parking violation fee before you can proceed." For a moment, Ryan could only stare. His brain refused to process the sheer absurdity of what was happening. A man was dying just feet away, and this woman, this petty tyrant, was worried about a fee? "Ma'am, I don't have time for this," he said, already stepping forward. Karen shifted immediately, blocking his way. "Paramedics think they're above the rules," she huffed. "Everyone has to follow HOA regulations. Just because you have flashing lights doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want." Jess, who prided herself on staying calm under pressure, felt her patience snap. "Lady, get out of the way before we call the police." Karen smirked. "Go ahead. They'll agree with me. I'm the HOA president. My word is law here." By now, a small crowd had begun gathering, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Porch lights flicked on. Neighbors peeked from their windows. And then, a scream. Sophie burst onto the porch, eyes wild, face streaked with tears. "Please, my grandfather, he's getting worse." That was all the confirmation Ryan needed. He brushed past Karen, ignoring her indignant screeching. Jess followed, but not before Karen slapped a bright yellow violation notice onto the ambulance windshield. It would have been laughable, if it wasn't so goddamn infuriating. By the time Ryan and Jess had Henry Wallace stabilized in the back of the ambulance, Karen was still outside, arms crossed, chin lifted, acting as if she had won some sort of victory. The yellow violation notice flapped against the windshield in the light breeze, a ridiculous reminder of her pettiness. But neither paramedic had time to dwell on her nonsense. Ryan hopped into the driver's seat, Jess secured their patient, and the ambulance roared away, sirens blaring as they raced toward the hospital. But Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning, she stormed into the Maplewood HOA office, a cramped, self-important little building that was really nothing more than a glorified storage shed in the community park. The HOA board members sat around a folding table, whispering among themselves when she barged in. Their murmurs turned to uneasy silence. She dropped her clipboard onto the table with a loud thud. "What the hell was that last night?" she snapped, eyes scanning the room for someone, anyone, to back her up. "Why weren't any of you standing with me?" Greg, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Karen, you were trying to find an ambulance." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes as if the explanation was beneath her. "Rules are rules. They parked in a restricted zone without approval. The HOA bylaws exist for a reason. If we start making exceptions, we invite chaos." Deborah Lawson, the vice president, pinched the bridge of her nose. "We're getting flooded with complaints, Karen. Someone recorded everything. The video is all over the internet." Karen's smirk faltered. "Wait. Who posted it?" Deborah sighed and turned her laptop around. On the screen, a neighborhood forum post titled "HOA President Tries to Find an Ambulance During Medical Emergency" was blowing up. Thousands of comments poured in by the second. "This woman is pure evil. How is this real? Fire her immediately. She should be arrested." Karen's face turned red as she scrolled through the replies, fingers tightening on the edge of the table. "This is libel," she hissed. "We need to put out a statement, tell people the paramedics were being aggressive, that they were breaking HOA policies." Greg shook his head. "Karen, you blocked an ambulance. We can spin this." Karen insisted. Deborah gave her a tired look. "Karen, we're done." Before she could process what that meant, her phone buzzed violently on the table. She glanced at the screen and nearly choked. Hundreds of notifications. Calls. Texts. Voicemails. And then, her doorbell rang. For the first time in her life, Karen felt something dangerously close to panic. She rushed home, slammed the door behind her, and peeked through the blinds. A local news crew was outside. Microphones in hand. Cameras rolling. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Then, the HOA email alert popped up on her phone. She clicked it open with trembling fingers. "Dear Ms. Thompson. Due to recent events, the board will be holding an emergency vote regarding your position as HOA president. We strongly advise that you step down voluntarily." Her hands clenched into fists. They were turning on her. Fine. If they wanted a war, she'd give them one. That night, as the news reports continued to rip her apart, Karen sat down at her desk, cracked her knuckles, and filed a formal lawsuit against the ambulance department. Her official claim? Reckless conduct, noise violations, and damage to Maplewood's peaceful environment. She wasn't just going to fight back, she was going to make them pay. Karen sat back in her chair, a smug smile creeping onto her lips as she finalized her lawsuit against the ambulance department. If they thought she was just going to take this lying down, they were dead wrong. The HOA rules were her domain, and she would use every legal loophole to make sure those paramedics regretted ever defying her. She hit send and watched with satisfaction as the confirmation email appeared in her inbox. Let's see them ignore me now. The next morning, she strutted into the HOA office, ready to demand support from the board. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was off. The usual tension that came with her presence had turned into something different, a quiet resistance, an unspoken shift in power. Greg and Deborah sat stiffly at the table, exchanging glances. The other board members avoided eye contact. Karen placed her hands on her hips. Well? Who's handling the media crisis? We need to issue a statement blaming the paramedics. I suggest we push the narrative that they were hostile and refused to cooperate with HOA regulations. Greg let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. Karen, sit down. Karen's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Deborah folded her arms. There's nothing to spin. The mayor is talking about drafting laws to limit HOA power because of you. The city council is considering an official complaint. And we just got an email from the fire department's lawyer. They're threatening to countersue for harassment if you don't drop this nonsense. Karen's stomach tightened, but she forced a scoff. You're all overreacting. Greg shook his head. No, Karen, we're done. She frowned, for the first time noticing a thick manila folder sitting on the table. What's that? Greg slid it toward her. An audit of your tenure as HOA president. Karen snatched it up and flipped it open. The first page alone made her breath hitch. Unapproved backyard shed, violation. Unpaid HOA dues, violation. Personal vehicle illegally parked overnight, violation. Her own violations. Deborah leaned forward, voice sickeningly sweet. You've been in violation of multiple HOA rules for years, Karen. We just never enforced them because you were president. Karen slammed the folder shut. This is a joke. No, Greg said, his voice firm. This is justice. You fined people for things you were guilty of yourself. And now? We're hitting you with every penalty you ever issued to others. Karen's face burned hot. You can't do this. Oh, we can, Deborah said. And we are. She slid another paper across the table. Here's the total amount due from your fines, $11,450. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. If you don't pay, Greg continued, we foreclose on your house. She stared. This wasn't happening. This was some nightmare. But it wasn't. And then Greg delivered the final blow. By unanimous vote, we've also decided to remove you as HOA president, effective immediately. Karen's entire body stiffened. You can't. I was elected. The board has authority to remove any president acting against the best interests of the community, Deborah interrupted. And you? You are a liability. Karen shook her head, gripping the table like a lifeline. No. No, this wasn't happening. You have 24 hours to vacate your office, Greg said. Karen was speechless. For the first time in her entire reign, she had lost. But she refused to go down quietly. As she stormed out of the office, she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. If she couldn't get her position back the normal way, then she'd do it her way. She was going to rig the system. Karen refused to accept defeat. The HOA was her domain, and she would not be stripped of her power by a bunch of ungrateful, spineless board members. If they wanted to play dirty, she would play dirtier. She spent the night making calls, reaching out to the few remaining die-hard HOA supporters who still believed in strict rule enforcement. She manipulated, guilt-tripped, and threatened. She crafted a petition for a re-election, stuffing it with fake signatures, claiming that the majority of residents wanted her back. But when she tried to submit it the next morning, she was met with silence. No one was backing her. Instead, what greeted her was something far worse, a block party. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk as she stared at the colorful banners strung between the houses. Tables lined the street, loaded with food and drinks. Neighbors were actually laughing, kids played without a care, and the best part? At the center of it all, standing proudly in front of the community park stage, was Eric Dawson, the man whose father nearly died because of her. And he was the new HOA president. Karen's vision blurred with rage. How dare they? How dare they act as if this was some victory? She stormed forward, ready to shut it down. Before she could even reach the stage, a firm hand gripped her arm. She turned sharply and found herself face to face with Danny, the neighborhood security guard. Karen, he said, his tone amused but firm, this is a private event. Karen scoffed. I have every right to be here. This is my. Danny shook his head. Nope. Not anymore. She ripped her arm free. Oh, please. You have no authority to stop me. He smirked. Actually, I do. You don't live here anymore. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. What? Danny casually pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to her. She yanked it open, her eyes darting over the legal jargon, her breath catching. Notice of foreclosure. Her own HOA had turned on her, had fined her into financial ruin, and now, they had taken her house. She staggered back. This is illegal. No, Karen, a familiar voice said from behind. She turned and saw Deborah, grinning. This is HOA policy. You enforce these rules on others. Now, they apply to you. Karen felt the heat crawl up her neck. You can't do this to me. I am the HOA. Deborah chuckled. You were. Now? She shrugged. You're just another rule breaker. The crowd erupted into cheers. Someone popped open a champagne bottle. Karen turned scarlet. No, she muttered. This isn't over. I'll sue every single one of you. I have lawyers. No, you don't, Greg called from the crowd, holding up his phone. We checked. Not a single lawyer in town wants to represent you. Looks like you're on your own. Karen staggered back. And then, the final blow. A police car rolled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. The lead officer cleared his throat. Karen Thompson. Karen's stomach twisted. What? You're under investigation for obstruction of emergency services. The crowd gasped. The whispers turned into cheers. Someone yelled, lock her up. Karen felt the ground tilt beneath her. This isn't real. The officer handed her a court summons. You have a hearing next month. Failure to appear will result in an arrest warrant. Karen froze. For the first time in her entire life, she had no control. No power. No way out. She had lost. Completely. And the whole neighborhood was celebrating. Karen's downfall should have been the end of the story. It should have been the moment she accepted defeat, packed her things, and disappeared from Maplewood forever. But Karen was never the type to go down gracefully. Even after losing her home, her position, and her reputation, she wasn't done. A month later, Maplewood thrived under its new HOA president, Eric Dawson. The ridiculous fines were gone, the threats had stopped, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. To celebrate, the residents organized another block party, a real one this time, not the kind Karen used to ban because of noise violations. It was a night of food, music, and laughter, a final farewell to the dictatorship that had ruled over them for far too long. And then, in the middle of it all, she appeared. Karen. She wasn't in her usual pantsuit. Instead, she wore an oversized hoodie, sunglasses, and, was that a wig? It was laughable, really, watching her try to blend in like she hadn't spent years terrorizing these people. Someone gasped. A few people snorted. Then a voice rang out. Oh my God, is that Karen? The entire crowd turned. And just like that, the block party exploded into laughter. Karen's face burned red. She hadn't come to apologize. She had come to sneak into the very celebration thrown in her honor, honoring her downfall. Eric approached her, shaking his head. Karen. Seriously? Danny, the security guard, smirked. You do know you don't live here anymore, right? Karen squared her shoulders. I have friends here. The laughter only grew louder. Someone from the back yelled, where? Karen's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of support, but there was none. Even her most loyal rule followers had abandoned her. She had no more allies, no more power. And then, the final humiliation. Deborah stepped forward, crossing her arms. Karen, HOA rules clearly state that trespassers will be removed from private property. Danny grinned. And we know how much you love enforcing HOA rules. The crowd roared. Karen spun on her heels and bolted. As she disappeared down the street, a voice called out behind her. HOA rules, no trespassing, Karen. And that was it. Maplewood was finally, completely, free. As Ryan and Jess stood near the refreshment table, watching the whole thing unfold, Jess smirked. You ever think she'll learn? Ryan laughed. Nope. Jess raised her drink. To the dumbest HOA president in history. Ryan clinked his glass against hers. And to never paying a parking fine for an ambulance. The party raged on, the neighborhood finally at peace. Because Karen was gone. For good. But what about you? Have you ever dealt with an HOA Karen in your neighborhood? What's the worst HOA rule you've ever encountered? Share your story below, let's see who had it worse.